The Old Woman and the Boy Moral Story. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled amidst rolling hills, there lived an old woman named Mrs. Thompson. She was known throughout the village for her kind heart and wise counsel. Every evening, she would sit on her porch, knitting sweaters and sharing stories with the neighborhood children. One sunny afternoon, a mischievous young boy named Tommy came to visit Mrs. Thompson. Tommy was known for his reckless behavior and disregard for rules. Mrs. Thompson welcomed him warmly, offering him a seat beside her. As they chatted, Tommy noticed a jar on Mrs. Thompson's table filled with colorful candies. His eyes gleamed with excitement, and he couldn't resist asking, "Can I have some candies, Mrs. Thompson?" Mrs. Thompson smiled gently and replied, "Of course, Tommy. But first, let me tell you a story." Intrigued, Tommy settled in eagerly as Mrs. Thompson began her tale. "Once upon a time, there was a young boy much like you, Tommy. He was curious and adventurous, always seeking thrills without considering the consequences. One day, he stumbled upon a magical garden filled with all sorts of wonders, including a jar of tempting candies just like these." Tommy's eyes widened with interest as he listened intently. "However," Mrs. Thompson continued, "the garden was protected by a wise old owl who warned the boy not to take anything without permission." Ignoring the owl's advice, the boy grabbed a handful of candies and dashed away. Tommy's expression faltered as he realized the moral of the story. But as soon as the boy left the garden, he found himself trapped in a maze of thorns and brambles. Mrs. Thompson concluded. He regretted his actions deeply, wishing he had listened to the owl's wisdom. Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding the lesson behind the story. With newfound humility, he looked at Mrs. Thompson and said, "I'm sorry for asking for candies without permission. Thank you for teaching me this important lesson." Mrs. Thompson smiled, patting Tommy's hand affectionately. "You're welcome, dear. Remember, it's always better to seek wisdom than to chase after fleeting pleasure." From that day forward, Tommy became known as a wiser and more thoughtful boy, often seeking Mrs. Thompson's guidance before embarking on his adventures. As for Mrs. Thompson, her stories continued to inspire and teach valuable lessons to all who listened, proving that wisdom knows no age. Moral: listen to wisdom, choose wisely. Thank you all for taking the time to watch The Old Woman and the Boy. Enjoy and subscribe to my YouTube channel MBY Kids.